You can tell a man's true character by how he treats the woman no one else is watching, Sophia whispered, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The chandelier light above Romano's private event room spilled across polished glass and white roses, turning everything soft and expensive, but nothing in that room felt soft when the black maid at the far end of the table lowered her eyes and kept folding napkins with careful, steady hands. Her name was Lena Carter, and she had spent the last 6 years learning how to move quietly in a world that never bothered to notice her. Tonight, she was only supposed to refill water glasses and clear empty plates at the engagement dinner of Matteo Vescari, one of the most powerful men in the city, a man whose smile never reached his eyes and whose presence made even grown men straighten their backs. Lena had been working since sunrise, taking 2 buses across town, and she was already exhausted, but she still carried herself with the same calm dignity she always did, even when the guests looked through her as if she were part of the wallpaper. At the center of the room, Matteo sat beside his bride-to-be, his dark suit sharp enough to cut the light, one hand resting near a crystal tumbler while the other tapped a slow rhythm against the table. He was listening to the laughter around him, but his gaze kept drifting toward the maid, as if something about her stillness had unsettled him. Across from her, his fiancé's relatives spoke too loudly, too confidently, dressed in their finest clothes and wearing the kind of smiles that meant they expected everyone else to know their place. When one of them snapped his fingers and ordered Lena to bring more ice without even looking at her face, she simply nodded and turned toward the service door, her expression unreadable. But before she could take one step, the room changed. A child's voice, small and uncertain, called from the far side of the table, "Mama said to be polite." The little boy had wandered in with one of the attendants, and he was staring directly at Matteo with wide, serious eyes, as if he had somehow seen through every layer of polished power in the room. The guests laughed awkwardly, not sure whether to smile or ignore him, but Lena stopped where she stood, because she recognized that look immediately. It was the look of a child trying to protect something fragile. Matteo did not speak at first. He only watched the boy, then Lena, then the uneasy faces around the table, and something in his expression began to shift, almost imperceptibly, like a locked door turning open by a single key. Lena lowered her head again, expecting the moment to pass, expecting to be invisible the way she always was, but Matteo's eyes stayed on her with a focus that made her hands still. And in that quiet, under the shine of the chandelier and the judgment of everyone at the table, the first crack appeared in the perfect evening they had all planned. The little boy was still standing beside the table, his small hands gripping the edge of his shirt as if he were the only brave thing in the room. Matteo studied him for one long, unreadable second, and then his gaze shifted back to Lena. It was not the look of a man who had been amused, and not the look of a man who had been insulted either. It was something quieter, sharper, and far more dangerous to the polished certainty everyone else had brought into the room. Lena kept her eyes lowered, but she could feel that attention on her like a spotlight, steady and impossible to escape. She had spent years learning how to make herself small in rooms like this, how to move silently, how to become useful without becoming noticed, and yet the child had somehow done what no one else had dared to do. He had looked at her and spoken to her as if she mattered. Across the table, Sophia gave a tight, nervous smile, trying to smooth over the moment, but the guests were no longer relaxed. Forks hovered above plates. Conversations had died in mid-breath. Even the piano in the corner seemed to have gone quiet, as if the whole room understood that something had changed, though no one yet knew what it was. Matteo finally crouched down to the boy's level, his expensive suit folding carefully at the knees, and when he spoke, his voice came out lower than before, measured and almost gentle. "And who are you?" The boy lifted his chin. "I am Luca. And she is not invisible." The words landed softly, but they struck harder than any raised voice could have. A few guests looked down at their plates. One woman reached for her water glass and forgot to drink from it. Lena's fingers tightened around the stack of napkins in her hands. She had not expected kindness, and she certainly had not expected it from a room that had spent the last hour treating her like part of the furniture. Matteo looked at Luca for another beat, then slowly rose and turned toward Lena. The room watched him as if his next movement might decide the fate of the evening. "What is your name?" he asked. Lena hesitated, surprised by the question itself more than the tone. Most people in rooms like this never asked. They pointed, ordered, or ignored. They never asked. "Lena," she said quietly. Matteo repeated it once, as if making sure he had heard it correctly. "Lena." Then he glanced at the empty place beside Luca, where a folded napkin had been set down by another guest and never touched. "How long have you worked for my family?" 3 years, she answered. "And before that?" "At 2 other houses." Her voice stayed calm, but something inside her had begun to tremble, the way a held breath trembles before it finally escapes. Matteo's expression did not change much, and that was what made it harder to read. He was not smiling. He was not angry. He was listening. Really listening. "Then you already know," he said, "that children usually see things adults have trained themselves not to notice." A few people shifted uncomfortably at that. The words had landed too close to the center of the room, too close to the truth. Lena looked at Luca, then back at Matteo, and for the first time that night she felt less like a shadow passing through other people's lives and more like a person standing at the edge of a turning point. Matteo reached out, not to touch her, but to take the napkins from her hands with unexpected care. "Put those down," he said. "You are not serving tonight." Lena blinked, certain she had misunderstood. "Sir, I have not finished, you have done enough," he replied, and this time there was no room for argument in his voice. Then, with the same calm precision that made the entire table hold still, he pulled out the chair beside Luca and indicated for her to sit. The guests stared openly now. Sophia's smile had vanished. Lena felt heat rise in her face, not from shame this time, but from the sudden terror of being seen. She had spent so long surviving by disappearing that visibility itself felt like a risk. Matteo noticed that too. His eyes softened by a fraction, just enough to make the moment more unsettling, because it suggested he understood far more than he was saying. "Sit," he repeated, quieter now. "My son has already invited you to the table. I would not insult his judgment." And in that simple sentence, spoken without drama and without ornament, the balance of the room began to tilt. The people who had smiled too politely were now silent. The woman who had laughed first was suddenly fascinated by her plate. The air itself felt different, heavier with the strange and uncomfortable truth that dignity had entered the room wearing an apron, and no one had been prepared for it. Lena lowered herself into the chair as if stepping into a world she had never been allowed to enter, while Luca looked up at her with unwavering approval, as though he had already known she belonged there all along. The table stayed quiet, but it was no longer the kind of silence that came from politeness. It was the kind that came right before people realized they had been wrong. Lena lowered herself into the chair beside Luca, still feeling as though every pair of eyes in the restaurant had settled on the simple apron tied around her waist. The linen napkin was folded beside her plate, the crystal glasses caught the warm light overhead, and everything around her looked like it belonged to another life. She should have felt grateful just to remain there. Instead, she felt the strange, fragile pressure of being noticed. Matteo said nothing at first. He stood behind his son's chair, one hand resting lightly on the wood, his expression unreadable as he watched Luca talk to Lena with the easy certainty children carried so naturally. The little boy pointed toward the breadbasket, then looked up at her with a shy seriousness that made her heart ache. "You can have some," he said. "You should eat too." The words were small, but they landed harder than anything else in the room. Lena blinked once, then offered him a careful smile. "That is very kind of you," she said softly. "Thank you." Across the table, Matteo's relatives exchanged looks that tried and failed to hide their discomfort. They had expected laughter, maybe even embarrassment, but not this. Not a child offering generosity to a woman they had already decided was beneath them. Matteo's aunt shifted in her seat. His cousin stared into his drink. Someone cleared a throat and then thought better of speaking at all. Matteo noticed every one of them, but his attention kept returning to Lena. She was not polished, not practiced, not interested in impressing anyone, and that seemed to unsettle him more than the fancy room or the carefully arranged dinner ever could. There was something in the way she sat there, straight-backed and quiet, as if she had spent years learning how to take up as little space as possible and still survive the world. He recognized that kind of restraint. It had never been weakness. It had been endurance. Luca, meanwhile, had decided Lena belonged at the center of the evening. He slid the small plate in front of her with both hands, then looked up at Matteo as if presenting evidence in a case he did not fully understand. "She can stay, right?" he asked. The question was innocent, but it struck the room with unusual force. Matteo looked at his son for a long second, then at Lena, and something subtle shifted in his face. "Yes," he said at last. "She can stay." The answer was simple, but it changed the air around them. It was not just permission. It was recognition. For the first time that night, Lena did not feel like an extra person in a room full of important ones. She felt seen, and that frightened her almost as much as it comforted her. Because being seen had always come with a cost. Matteo pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, his movements unhurried, controlled, almost too calm. Yet even in that calm, there was a tension he did not bother to hide anymore. "Tell me," he said quietly, "what made my son decide you were worth listening to before the rest of us did?" The question was not cruel, but it was direct, and it made the nearby conversations die completely. Lena kept her hands folded in her lap. She looked at Luca, then back at Matteo. "Sometimes children notice what adults overlook," she said. "They do not spend as much time deciding who matters." Matteo held her gaze, and for a moment, the polished world around them seemed to loosen at the seams. He had been prepared for a servant. He had not been prepared for a woman with enough stillness to make everyone else look uneasy. He had not been prepared for the uncomfortable feeling that his son had chosen wisely. And somewhere beneath the layers of control and caution he wore so well, Matteo began to understand that this was no ordinary evening. This was the beginning of a question he could not yet name. Matteo did not look away from Lena after that question. If anything, his attention sharpened, as if her answer had confirmed something he had already begun to suspect. Luca sat beside her with both feet planted carefully on the floor, his little shoulders relaxed now, his earlier fear replaced by the calm certainty children sometimes found before adults did. The restaurant had returned to motion around them, but the sound felt distant, softened by the weight of what had just changed at their table. Lena kept her hands neatly folded, though her pulse still seemed loud enough to hear. She had spent most of her life being told to stand behind people, to wait, to speak only when spoken to. Now she was sitting beside a boy who watched her as if she mattered, and a man who had built a world around control was studying her like she was the only honest thing in the room. Matteo lifted his glass, then set it down untouched. His expression remained unreadable, but something in his jaw had eased, the first sign that he was no longer simply observing. "Luca does not trust easily," he said at last, his voice low and measured. "He has dismissed tutors, ignored doctors, and refused every caretaker I have placed in front of him." Lena glanced at the child beside her, then back to Matteo. "Maybe he was never looking for someone to place in front of him," she said softly. "Maybe he was looking for someone willing to kneel beside him." A few seats away, one of Matteo's guests shifted uncomfortably. Another lowered her eyes to her plate. No one wanted to interrupt now, not with the room feeling as though it had crossed some invisible line. Matteo watched Lena for a long moment, and then, with a decision that seemed to surprise even him, he pulled out the chair directly across from Luca and sat down. The movement was quiet, but it changed the shape of the evening. The man everyone had expected to remain above the table had chosen to come down into the conversation. Luca turned toward him, surprised and pleased at once. Lena felt the shift immediately. This was no longer a performance for the room. It had become something private, something honest. Matteo rested one forearm on the table and looked at his son. Then tell me, he said, what exactly did she do that the rest of us missed? Luca brightened, ready to answer, but before he could speak, Lena gave a small, almost apologetic smile and shook her head. He does not need me to explain myself, she said. He already understood. Matteo let out a slow breath, and for the first time that evening, the tension around his eyes loosened completely. The silence that followed was not cold. It was thoughtful. It was the silence of a man realizing that power had never reached the part of life where trust was earned. And Lena, still seated beside the boy who had chosen her without hesitation, had the unsettling sense that whatever had brought her to this table was not ending tonight. It was only beginning. Lena did not move when the conversation around the table shifted again, but she felt the change in the room as clearly as if someone had opened a door to colder air. Matteo's question had not been loud, yet it had carried more weight than any raised voice could have managed. People who were used to being obeyed often forgot how silence could command an entire room. Luca seemed to understand that instinctively. He sat straight in his chair, his eyes moving between Matteo and Lena with the open trust only a child could wear without shame. She listened, he said at last, as if the answer were obvious. She did not laugh at me. She did not talk to me like I was little. She just listened. The words landed softly, but they changed everything. A few of the guests looked down at their plates. One woman pretended to adjust her napkin. Another man cleared his throat and suddenly found his drink very interesting. Matteo's face remained controlled, but something in his expression had gone still and thoughtful, as if he were seeing a part of his son that had been hidden in plain sight. Is that all? He asked, though his voice had gentled. Luca shook his head. No. She told me I could be brave even when I was scared. That made Lena lower her eyes for a moment. She had not meant for those words to matter so much. To her, they had been simple comfort. To a child like Luca, they had become a small and permanent light. Matteo looked at her then with a different kind of attention, one that no longer felt like scrutiny. It felt closer to recognition. And did you believe her? He asked. Luca nodded immediately. Because she was scared too. The answer passed through the table like a quiet pulse. Lena lifted her gaze, surprised that the boy had seen her so clearly. Matteo did not speak right away. He leaned back slightly, one hand resting near his glass, his eyes fixed on his son with a kind of restrained astonishment that made him look less like the man everyone feared and more like a father trying to rediscover something he had nearly forgotten. You noticed that, he said at last. Luca frowned in the innocent way children did when adults treated simple truths like mysteries. Of course I noticed. Then he turned to Lena, and his voice softened. You were nice to me when everybody else was looking at you funny. The sentence was so pure it seemed to empty the air around it. Lena's throat tightened. She had spent much of her life being watched without being seen, judged without being understood. Now, at a table filled with expensive glass and polished silver, it was this little boy who had given her the kind of dignity she had rarely been allowed to keep. Matteo saw the shift in her face before she could hide it. For a man who spent his life reading lies, hesitation, and fear, the truth in that expression was impossible to miss. He did not ask her to explain. He did not interrupt. Instead, he watched his son look at her with complete certainty, and watched Lena sit there with quiet composure, as if both of them were carrying a truth the rest of the room had not earned yet. The waiter returned with a fresh plate for Luca, but even that ordinary sound felt distant now. Matteo's jaw tightened once, not in anger, but in thought. Then he said, almost casually, you make him calm. Lena blinked. I only spoke to him. That was enough, Matteo replied, and his tone carried something she had not expected from him at all, respect. Luca, pleased to be understood, picked up his fork but did not eat right away. She knows how to listen, he said proudly. Not like the others. That earned a few awkward shifts from the adults nearby, but Matteo did not correct him. Instead, He studied Lena as if his son had just revealed the one detail that mattered most. The room remained perfectly still for a brief, fragile moment. Then Matteo asked, "What is it you do when you are not sitting at my table?" The question was simple, but it opened the door to a life Lena had spent years trying to keep hidden from people with expensive opinions. She folded her hands in her lap and answered with the kind of honesty that came only after too many lessons in surviving hard things. "Whatever work I can find." Matteo's gaze did not leave her. And for the first time that evening, he looked less like a man evaluating someone and more like a man realizing he had been wrong about what mattered. The room listened. Lena kept her posture steady. And somewhere between the child who trusted her and the father who was beginning to see her, the evening quietly changed shape. Before anyone at the table could decide whether to speak, Luca reached for Lena's hand again, his small fingers curling around hers with the same easy trust that had unsettled every adult in the room. The boy was smiling now, as if the simple act of being near her had made the evening feel safer than it had in weeks. Matteo noticed that smile, and something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the hard edge of command giving way to a quieter kind of attention. Lena felt it, too. She had spent so many years learning how quickly people judged her by her clothes, her voice, her place in the room. But this was different. No one had asked her to prove herself to Luca. He had simply known. "You do not sound like someone who has given up," Matteo said at last, his voice low and measured. Lena looked down at her lap for a moment before answering. Giving up was never really an option. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of every long shift, every bill paid late, every morning she had woken up and kept going because someone had to. Across the table, one of the older men cleared his throat as if impatient with the conversation, but Matteo did not turn. His focus remained on Lena, as steady as a locked door. "And what would you do if you were given one?" he asked. The question caught her off guard. For a brief second, the polished room, the crystal glasses, the murmuring staff, all of it seemed to fall away. No one had ever asked her what she would do with a chance. She had only ever been told to be grateful for whatever little she was handed. Lena lifted her eyes and met his gaze. "I would make sure my son never had to feel invisible the way I did," she said quietly. The answer settled over the table like dust in sunlight. Luca stared at her with open admiration, as if she had just said something brilliant. Matteo, however, went still. The room seemed to hold its breath around him. He had expected a practical answer, maybe a complaint, maybe a plea. Instead, she had given him the kind of truth that could not be bought or rehearsed. It was the truth of someone who had lived without being seen and had still found a way to remain gentle. Matteo looked at her for a long moment, then slowly leaned back in his chair. "That is not what most people would say," he murmured. Lena almost smiled. "Most people have not had to think that way." There was no bitterness in her voice, only honesty, and that honesty seemed to land harder than any accusation could have. Outside the tall windows, the city lights glowed against the dark glass, but inside the room, every face had turned toward her without meaning to. Even the staff had slowed, waiting. Matteo's eyes remained on Lena, thoughtful now, almost searching. Somewhere beneath his control, beneath the careful discipline that had built his world, a new realization was taking shape. The woman sitting beside his son was not trying to impress anyone. She was not performing kindness. She was simply living it. And that, more than anything, made her impossible to ignore. The dinner had changed shape in ways no one at the table could fully explain, but everyone could feel. The polished silverware, the crystal glasses, the low amber light hanging above the long table, all of it seemed to hold still around Lena as Luca sat beside her with his hand still resting lightly in hers. Matteo watched that small gesture more closely than anything else in the room. It was not just affection. It was certainty. A child did not cling like that without reason, and Matteo had spent too many years listening to instincts before he trusted words. Lena remained composed, but there was something in the steadiness of her face that kept pulling his attention back. She was not trying to win him over. She was not watching for approval. She sat with the calm of someone who had already survived disappointment and learned not to beg for kindness. That kind of quiet strength unsettled him more than any dramatic plea could have. Across the table, one of Matteo's older associates shifted in his chair and cleared his throat, as though the silence itself had become inconvenient. He glanced between father and son, then at Lena, then quickly away again when Matteo noticed. No one wanted to be the first to speak now, because the room had moved past ordinary conversation. It had entered the dangerous space where assumptions began to crack. Luca, unaware of the weight settling over the adults, turned toward Lena and said softly that he liked when she talked because she made things sound simple. The honesty of that sentence drew the smallest breath from the people nearest him. Matteo did not interrupt. He only looked at her, waiting. Lena lowered her eyes for a brief moment, then answered in a voice that was gentle without being fragile. "Children understand more than people think," she said. "They know when someone is pretending." The words hung in the air without apology. Matteo felt them land. Pretending was a language his world knew well. Smiling while judging. Promising while calculating. Protecting while keeping score. Lena sounded as if she had lived too close to those truths to speak about them lightly. Matteo leaned back slightly in his chair, one hand resting against the armrest, his expression unreadable. Then, with the kind of calm that only came from genuine curiosity, he asked her where she had learned to read people so well. It was a simple question, but the room seemed to tighten around it. Lena looked toward the dark windows for a second, as if measuring how much of herself to reveal. When she spoke, her answer was not rehearsed and not dramatic. She said that when a person has spent enough time being overlooked, they learn to notice what others miss. They learn to listen to tone, to posture, to the pause before a lie. The sentence was quiet, but it carried the weight of years. Matteo did not respond right away. He simply studied her, and in that long silence something shifted deeper than interest. He was beginning to understand that Lena did not carry herself like someone asking for rescue. She carried herself like someone who had built her own dignity in rooms that had tried to deny it. That realization sat between them, heavy and undeniable, while Luca squeezed her hand once more and smiled as if he had already sensed the truth before any adult did. The room remained still, but now it was the stillness before recognition, before a man admits to himself that the person in front of him is not what he expected, and that expectation was the first thing being put to rest. By the time the first course had been cleared, the table no longer felt like a performance. It felt like a test that had already changed the people sitting inside it. Matteo remained quiet, but his silence was no longer dismissive. It was watchful, measured, the silence of a man realizing that the easiest way to misjudge someone was to assume she needed to be protected rather than understood. Lena sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture calm, though every instinct told her she was still one wrong word away from being pushed back into the role she had always been handed by strangers. Luca, however, seemed entirely uninterested in the tension adults carried. He leaned into her side as if he had known her far longer than a single evening, and that simple trust kept unsettling the room in the gentlest possible way. When Matteo finally asked what had made her so observant, Lena did not try to make herself sound impressive. She simply told the truth. She said that people who are used to being dismissed learn to notice everything because they have no other choice. They hear the hesitation before a lie. They see who is kind when no one is watching. They learn that dignity is often revealed in the smallest actions, never the loudest ones. The words settled over the table with a quiet force. Matteo looked at her for a long moment, and in that look was something that had not been there before. Respect. Not the kind offered out of politeness, but the kind that arrives only after pride has been forced to sit down and think. Across from him, his sister lowered her gaze, suddenly aware that Lena had never been trying to win favor. She had simply been steady enough to remain herself in a room designed to make her feel smaller. Luca tugged lightly at Lena's sleeve and asked, in that childlike voice that never knew how to hide its certainty, whether she would come back again. The question made the room still for a different reason this time. It was not embarrassment now, but the fragile recognition that a child had already made a decision the adults around him were only beginning to understand. Lena smiled, and it was small, almost shy, yet it held a warmth that reached deeper than admiration ever could. Matteo saw it. He saw the ease in his son's face, the comfort in the way the boy refused to let go of her hand, and the unmistakable calm that seemed to settle around Lena whenever Luca was near. Something in him began to soften, not all at once, but enough to be felt. He had spent years believing control was the same thing as leadership, and protection was the same thing as love. But sitting there, watching his son trust a woman he had barely met, he felt the quiet and uncomfortable truth that he might have been wrong about both. The chandeliers above them glowed softly against the polished glass and silver, but the real light in the room came from what no one had planned. A child had seen her clearly before anyone else had. And now the father, slower but no less certain, was finally beginning to see what the child had recognized first. Lena did not ask for anything. She did not reach for sympathy or make herself smaller to fit the moment. She simply remained as she was, and that alone was enough to unsettle every assumption Matteo had brought to the table. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, calmer, almost careful. He asked if she had ever worked with children before. The question sounded simple, but the way he asked it told her it was more than a job interview. It was the first honest opening he had offered her. Lena met his gaze and answered without hesitation, and for the first time that evening, Matteo listened as if every word mattered. Before anyone at the table could speak, Matteo set his glass down with deliberate care, the soft click against crystal sounding louder than it should have in the quiet room. Lena sat perfectly still across from him, her hands folded, her face calm, though she could feel the weight of every glance moving toward her. Luca remained close, one small hand resting against her sleeve as if he understood that silence could be a kind of courage. Matteo studied her in that long, measuring way of his, the same way he had studied every person who had ever entered his world, yet this time the expression in his eyes was changing. It was not suspicion anymore. It was the beginning of respect. He asked her to tell him, slowly and plainly, how she knew what she knew, and Lena did not rush to fill the space. She answered with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned that facts did not need decoration to be true. She spoke about the children she had cared for, the routines she had built, the patience it took to calm fear before it turned into tears. She spoke about listening first, about noticing what others overlooked, about understanding that a child rarely needed to be managed when what he truly needed was to be understood. Across the table, Matteo said nothing for several seconds. Then he looked at his son, who had gone from restless to calm without anyone quite noticing when it happened, and something in his face softened in a way the people around him had never seen before. The room stayed very still. The silverware did not move. The chandeliers above them glowed warm and pale, but it was Luca who seemed to carry the light, because he was looking at Lena with complete trust, as if she had already proven herself in ways that mattered more than any polished introduction ever could. Matteo finally asked the question that had been waiting beneath everything else, the one that carried the shape of a real decision. Would she consider working for his family, not as a favor, not as a temporary solution, but as someone he could trust with the part of his life he guarded most carefully? Lena felt the air shift around the table. She understood what was being offered. It was security, yes, but it was also a test of character, of patience, of whether she could remain herself inside a world built by power and guarded by habit. She did not pretend to be overwhelmed. She did not lower her eyes. She simply met his gaze and answered with honesty. She would think about it, but only if she could do the work in her own way, with dignity intact and without being treated as invisible. Matteo held her gaze a moment longer than necessary, then gave a single slow nod. That small gesture changed the shape of the evening more than any speech could have. It told everyone at the table that he had heard her, not as help, not as a convenience, but as a person whose answer mattered. Luca smiled first, bright and immediate, and that smile broke the last of the tension that had held the room in place. For the first time all evening, Lena exhaled fully. She had not come to this table to be noticed, and yet she had done something far more powerful than draw attention. She had earned it. And in the quiet that followed, Matteo understood that the most important thing he had learned that night was not about childcare, or appearances, or even trust. It was that the woman he had nearly underestimated had already shown him exactly what dignity looked like when it refused to ask permission.